During the Vietnam War, an Admiral Jim Stockdale got captured and spent 8 years in war prison. And during that time, he observed that the pessimists didn't make it, died. And he observed that the optimists also didn't make it. Who made it were the ones that were radically optimistic in the long term and ruthlessly realistic in the short term. This is the frame I'd like to apply to what I'm sharing here, which is the most condensed form I can come up with at this point around how to contribute to making the planet a good place for all life or mutually assured thriving, which is what I've been concerned with almost ever since I can remember. When, let's say, between 5 and 10 years old, some things happened. When I was 10, Chernobyl blew up, for example. But there was also the ozone layer problem, there was acid rain, all sorts of issues that made it very clear that something had to be done. So I've been pondering this and playing with it and trying to understand it. So, with this, through the Stockdale paradox lens, I want to share something. I will share it in 3 steps. The situational assessment, to be very clear about where we are at the moment. Then the definition of success, which is to say, how could a good world, what could a good world look like? The broad shape, the broad outline of that. And then some ideas for how to go about building a bridge. So this is a useful frame for me to look at the current moment through. And I'd like to start with the top point with money. I'm going to go through all of those and somehow hopefully reveal that these are interlinked and constitute a multipolar trap that is very hard to get out of on an individual, collective, and even species wide level. And then move on how we can still maybe pull that off. So in 2003, my head was blown by 2 high finance dudes. One was Ernst Welteke, he was the head of the central bank in Germany, and Bernais, he had been the head of the central bank in Belgium and the architect of the introduction of the euro. And they wanted to introduce a new currency somewhere in Germany, which did never happened for political reasons. But that currency was designed completely differently from the money we know. And I just couldn't understand how these high finance dudes could come up with new money out of the blue. Bernard was so nice to explain the mechanics of that and also the emergent properties of the financial design that we are still using today. And this laid the foundation for a deep interrogation of other questions of the world, basically, finding other things that I had missed because I'd never questioned the nature of money. I'd always assumed that we just need it up to that day. And that was quite embarrassing in hindsight. And I'm pretty sure there are some other embarrassing things I need to find still. But yeah, I'm playing and trying with this. Okay, so M3, which is the sum of all the money out there that we create, it doubles every 10 years. It doubles because we continually create money, either through private banking or and through interest. So, and all of that combined generates a doubling every 10 years. And since 1971, we, first the US through Nixon, but ultimately the entire world, have tied their money to GDP as a backing mechanism, to our own to our own productivity. It seemed like an ingenious move first, but there's some very, very problematic issues with doing that. Because GDP ultimately counts how many atoms we can move around in our any given society, nation, bioregion over a period of time. And because the money supply increases, also the GDP has to increase. And it doubles every roughly 20 years. There's a gap between those, and that gap is mostly inflation. Now, the moving of atoms requires energy. And now energy doubles every 30 years. Currently, we're metabolizing 19 terawatts as a species, and 85% of those come from fossil fuels in an equivalent of 100 billion barrels of oil per year. And 1 barrel of oil roughly contains the energy equivalent of 5 human labor years, meaning you can either put the energy of 1 barrel of oil into your car, or you can push it for 5 years and it will get the same distance. We're now trying to move away from that into a renewable energy economy. And that seems pretty impossible because of material needs that comes with. So just to point out one of the minerals is copper. At current technological disposition, we need 4.7 billion tons of copper to pull that off. We've mined about 700 million in the last 6,000 years, and we will mine probably 900 million next 30 years. Leaves us with 3.1 billion tons of copper that we still need. Well, we know where they are on the planet, but getting them would severely disrupt the entire um, uh, sea life in the entire sea life, because we would have to scrape every last inch of all sea floors to get the nodules that contain rare earths. That sounds like a pretty stupid idea. Now, what happens when we cannot provide the energy? That whole house of cards obviously will crumble and fall. This is why we're currently pretty obsessed with trying to solve fusion or building small nuclear reactors, because it's too late to build the big ones. We should have started building them 10, 20 years ago, because we roughly need 3 to 400, and we're not building nearly as many. So fusion, if we find a solution to that, might be great in terms of providing the energy, but it'll still be problematic because it'll be controlled by only a few. And the fewer can control the energy supply, which is the foundation then for our configuration as a species, the easier it is to exert control and power and to hijack the entire species, basically. Now, we could do geothermal, We could, if plasma drilling actually works as it seems, then we could drill through tectonic plates, avoiding many of the problems we have at the edges of the tectonic plates. And that could actually turn out to be a feasible solution. But even if we do that, our excess heat in all of our processes that we run with that energy will still heat up the planet, meaning we will still have to somehow engineer a way out of this. We're just going to postpone the issue by two to 300 years. Knowing that is not really an option to go down that path. But our picture is not finished. So we still have to deal with politics and with the economy. Now, both politics and the economy measure their success through the increase of GDP, ultimately. And politics is locked into a short term marketing cycle, meaning any politician or party who wants to be elected or re elected needs to send the right message, the right message being the one that gets him or her re elected or elected, rather than the most truthful message, because the truth sometimes can be hard. And if the opponent engages in a more shallow conversation, then you will lose if you tell the truth. So there's a lose-lose dynamic going on that is a race to the bottom that will make the political discourse progressively more shallow and useless. And in addition to that, even if you get to do something while you are voted into power, you have only maybe 2 years, half your term roughly, to do something meaningful, if at all. And then if you don't get reelected, that gets erased again. So politics doesn't have a lot of say in any of this. But those dynamics that are ultimately tied to the actions of individuals still hold us in place. Also, because of the economic side of this, we need to create more stuff, extract more stuff so that we can create more stuff, and then put that stuff into landfills, basically, in order to move sufficient amounts of atoms. Now that leads to what I would call the Bernais explosion, meaning we're now really, really good at targeting individuals. We've seen that through social media, but we're now seeing that in an increased form with large language models, where you can precisely target an individual and get that individual, nudge that individual to think they need something that you sell them. And you can also use that same mechanism of the large language models and the emergent idea of AI to ultimately exponentially increase any process that you can think of in the economic space. So that's moving faster and faster, going into more exploitation, because just like in politics, if you are the first one to act according to your very likely ethical foundation as an individual, you will lose because somebody else will exploit. So again, there's a dynamic for the one who acts more ethically to lose, so that nobody has an incentive or positive incentive. Everybody is aligned along perverse incentives and also is engaged in a downward spiral. So this whole thing is self-terminating. This will end at one point. It might end in 5 years, it might end in 50 or 500, but ultimately it will end because it is built on dynamics that are geared towards infinite extraction and exploitation. We cannot do this on a finite planet. This has been said over and over again. I'm just repeating this so that we have a common ground and some language to talk about this situation. So that's the multipolar trap that we're in. That's the current assessment. We cannot get out of this easily because in itself, within one nation state, for example, or in one city, we're interlocked between the money supply, the energy, politics, and the economy. But then also on an international level, we're competing against each other also on the GDP level because higher GDP leads to higher power. So it's really hard to get out unless you're some pretty irrelevant country like Bhutan or Costa Rica. You have a really hard time to detach yourself, even in part, from GDP. So, what might a definition of success look like? So, how could we move forward in a way that is actually conducive to mutually assured thriving, to a multipolar trap that is geared to the positive? Well, if we become really optimistic, radically optimistic, and dream up a world that we would like to live in, we would like our offspring to live in, we would enjoy, then we would probably put life itself at the center. I've had hundreds of conversations with people from all demographics, all over the planet, in a very structured format that came from a book I wrote a couple of years ago around the question of what would a good configuration for life on this planet look like. And everybody agrees on the same core principles. Everybody says they want to live in on the Dunbar scale, meaning between 150 and 4,000 people, and they want to be embedded in nature with these people. And then everybody puts it on into a matrix between no tech and high tech, and monogamy and polyamory. So this tells me several things. One, there is a common thing about being human. We want something very similar if we allow ourselves to detach from the current constraints of the system. And that this thing is very close to the understanding that there is no life without life. We need a healthy environment to thrive. So we need a thriving environment around us so we can be healthy. So, how might this work? Let's go through those steps. So, we begin with the sun. Energy. This big fusion reactor in the sky sends us 172,000 terawatt. That's roughly 10,000 times as much as we think we need. This comes highly distributed. This comes for free to everybody on the planet. What if we could now create a new material economy based on that? Let's call those heliogenic materials. If you're wondering how that might work, think about the last meal you've had. That was heliogenic material. If you have a kombucha, this healthy, tasty, fizzy drink that has been cultivated by adding a culture to a cold tea with some sugar, wait a week, and while that culture doubles, it carburetes your water, your tea, and tastes amazing. Now, doubling in 1 week means that your neighbor now can receive the culture, or your best friend or whoever, and start doing that him or herself. And in next to nothing, all of humanity can stop buying Coke or other fizzy drinks and instead use kombucha. Now imagine that could be possible for any material, really. Well, you know, your clothing sometimes, hopefully, comes from plants. But you can also, with the latest material science, you can grow any kind of material, biomineralize any kind of material, biofabricate any kind of material between your food and your compute. Ultimately, we can build the whole stack of materials that humanity needs from very natural, in very natural pathways run on sunlight and some water and some sugar and some microorganisms, etc. Now, what would that mean? Imagine a new human being born, and for her birth, she receives this box from her community, a box containing all the seeds and microorganisms and fungi and that she might need in her bioregion for a successful, thriving life. And her education moves along the path of using that box, of how to grow, how to harvest, how to retain enough for the next season, how to give away surplus, because your surplus is always best stored in the tummies of your friends. That would lead to very, very sovereign humans. People who know that they can build their own house if they must. They don't have to. There will still be a market because not everybody feels compelled to make a living from growing roof tiles. Somebody would want to maybe engage in art. But somebody will grow the roof tiles. And so there's still a market, and we can still have all the needs we need provided for. So sovereignty as a replacement for economy, in the sense that everybody has all dimensions of what they need for a fulfilled life, based on heliogenic materials. Now, a human that has the opportunity to grow beyond the fundamental needs, Maslow 1, 2, and then up, can move along the developmental hierarchy much faster than somebody who has to struggle to solve Maslow 1 and 2. This image represents Bob Kegan's version of this. Ultimately, most developmental psychologists agree on a version of this. There are academic nuances that are important in some contexts, but for this, I'd just use Kegan's model. So we set out in our adult life as so-called socialized minds, which means that we understand the people around us. We understand the rules. They understand us. They trust us. We trust them. We function together. That's the basic need for a functioning society. But then, as we move along, we start stepping out of the socialist mind into the self authoring mind. We come up with ways of editing the rules to our own benefit. We come we This is an egoic phase. We do this for our own benefit. But as we do this, as we progress, we come to understand that we are always embedded in the environment. We cannot be detached from the environment. We become self transforming. We use the mechanism of editing that the self authoring mind used on the socialized mind. We start using that on the self authoring mind. This is a non egoic state. This is a state of serving. This is a state of understanding that one is part of the whole, and the well being of the whole constitutes your own well being. I mentioned Bernard Lietaer. Once Bernard was called up by the Belgian government because they had an issue in the city of Ghent. In one part of town, there were a lot of illegal immigrants with no jobs, so there was a downward spiral. Substance abuse, violence, and everything that comes with that. So Bernard went in and he asked the people living there about their dreams. And the majority dreamt of a little plot of land so they could grow something, some salad, something. So he invented a token, money, which could be earned by being nice to one's neighbors, by putting flowers in the windows, cleaning the street, cleaning the house. All of the things we know are conducive to getting people out of downward social spirals in cityscapes and towards positive outcomes. And that was the case there. And next to nothing, the entire environment turned, and with the environment, the people. And other cities followed. Bernard's idea was ultimately to create a central bank of dreams. Every human would put in their dream and could mint currency whenever somebody else would start fulfilling their dream. If we think that through based on abundant energy, abundant materials, and sovereign individuals, this is an economy, a model of how we operate as humans based on care. Care for the environment, care for one another, and care for oneself. Now, so far, we've been more or less subject to maybe higher level developments. This represents an idea that, starting with the Big Bang, a lot of energy clumped into mass, and the mass became more complex. And as it became more complex, at one point, a phase shift popped out life. Now, life started becoming more complex, and biological measures didn't seem to be enough anymore to organize the competing loss functions of that life, so that out popped mind to help with that. And then mind started doing the same thing, becoming more and more complex, until culture popped out. Culture turning more and more complex. What might be the next thing that pops out. One thing that might pop out is agency. Actually putting ourselves into the driver's seat of what's happening to us, not allowing frozen errors or design flaws in the way we organize ourselves as a species to push us into situations that are less than desirable. What if we could actually, on an individual and collective basis, find the agency to design our own coordination function, our own civilization, such that it is actually geared for thriving? And continuously review this, because as we change it, obviously it has to change again to fit. Okay, so now all of that together, I would call the heliogenic civilization. That's the basis, the multipolar trap that brings us into mutually assured thriving. So how do we get there? If we think about this strategically, we have to think about, or a useful lens is the three horizons model, where horizon one is acting more or less in the short term and it's going to fade out in the long term. Horizon two helps bridge. It plays its strength between the short term and the long term, somewhere in the midterm. And Horizon 3 unfolds its potential in the long term. So we are rooted in the here and now. We are part of this multipolar trap that I first showed. And let's assume we all agree we want to go into that other multipolar trap. What could that look like? In the following section, I'm going to just describe a few examples of what I am working on with other people. In each of these examples only works because of the amazing people working there. And these are just meant as an inspiration, just meant as an idea of what to do. This is just what we do through our narrow lens and our perspective on the world. There's so much more that needs to be done, and we have many other friends who do things. So I'm confident that we can get there, but it's helpful to be aligned in the understanding and in the language. All right. So Delity is a software engineering boutique and is clearly Horizon 1. It's rooted in the here now. Delity provides software engineering services to anybody who is ethically aligned and has an ethically aligned project. But Delity does one more thing. Because software engineering is a seller's market and high margins market, Delity can afford to do the right thing, not to exploit neither partners or clients nor our coworkers. We can create enormous freedoms for all of these stakeholders, really, if we decide to not be exploitative, to not optimize for our own needs. And this is only doable because of the amazing partner I have in this, who is fully aligned with that. But this gives us a platform for all the other things that allows us to be part of the current paradigm without exploiting too much. A good bridge could be what we're trying to do with the Initiative for the Regenerative Market Economy, with which we want to highlight and widen the public discourse around the question what actually constitutes Wohlstand. Wohlstand is a German word that encompasses things like wealth, prosperity, well being, social cohesion. It's much more nuanced than wealth. So we prefer using Wohlstand, and we want to find out what new Wohlstand might be. Because in the current political discourse is equivocated and public discourse is equivocated with money. And everybody knows that's bullshit. It's much more. So we're trying to figure that out with multiple streams of activity leading towards events like the new Wohlstand Festival in the summer of 2024, with which we want to highlight that conversation. Then there's Wagenbach Industries. Wagenbach Industries has set the goal for itself to be the first massive player in the heliogenic civilization, in the heliogenic industries. And it starts making a point of the kombucha economy by introducing roof tiles that work much like kombucha, using a massive waste stream. So, in the case of the city of Berlin, this would be 50,000 tons per year. That only is good for landfills. There's nothing that can be done with this kind of really final trash. Using that in connection with microorganisms to bind it into building materials, specifically roof tiles. Towards the end of the year, we hope to have this passed through certification and then start scaling it up. Ultimately, Wagenbach Industries will put these things into the commons and spread them into other domains while using the profits from richer parts of our species to subsidize that activity. With GITA, we have just concluded phase 2. Phase 1 was about meaning, understanding what impact and technology actually means, because GITA stands for Global Impact Tech Alliance. And phase 2 was about sense making, trying to really understand what is it that we're doing here at the moment, what's happening, and how could we allocate capital towards building the infrastructure for a good world, for the kind of paradigm I was highlighting. Now that we just come out of the sense-making part, we are formulating this into a book along with choice-making, meaning we will now offer pathways towards retrofitting cities with heliogenic materials. How would that work? With Motherland, we are creating local ecosystems in Africa between farmers and startups and solving supply chain issues for the farmers, providing new market access to the startups, and lifting the communities of the farmers out of poverty, or away from poverty, maybe not out of immediately. Within the first harvest, we managed to triple the income of the farmer. We, in addition to that, generate a community fund that then gets handed over to the community with governance to manage it appropriately. Ultimately, Motherland could serve as a way to spread the idea of the kombucha economy of heliogenic materials. And then last but not least, miracle. Miracle because we need a fucking miracle. Miracle is yet another nonprofit. Um, except for Delody, all of the above are nonprofits. A nonprofit to massively bring together the science and engineering to create the mechanics of a heliogenic civilization and put those into the commons so they cannot be hijacked by profit seeking interests. And then using mechanisms of Motherland, GITA, and all the beautiful projects out there in the world to propel this into the world. Okay. That's it. That's the theory of how we could move towards a situation of mutually assured thriving. Life at the center, run on sunlight, leading to sovereign individuals that, in collective agency, engage in care in all dimensions, individual, collective, and in the whole. So I hope this makes some sense. It's probably radically optimistic, but that's what it's supposed to be. And I'm happy for anybody who would like to comment on this, give me feedback, help, support. There's lots of work to be done. Thank you.